Hello everyone and welcome to Practical AAC, Strategies to Support Students Using Alternative and Augmentative Communication. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but we'll hopefully unpack that later. This is part of the training webinars from Bromley Healthcare and we hope you find it really useful. We're delighted that you can join us. My name is Tiffany Birch and I'm a specialist speech and language therapist in this area. This webinar is just meant to be an introduction, and so please do follow up with your speech and language therapist to get further information. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to look at what is AAC. We're going to have a look at different types of AAC and how we can use those effectively. And we're going to look at some of the difficulties that you or maybe your children or your students may encounter and how you can support them. What is AAC? Well, as I said, it stands for Alternative and Augmentative Communication. That basically means all forms of communication other than speech that can be used either instead of speech or alongside speech if speech is not sufficient to meet the child's needs. So, for example, we all use AAC. We use facial expressions, we use gestures and sign, we use symbols. So if you think about when you're driving, there are lots of symbols there. We use pictures, we use photos. So when we're sharing our holiday snaps or looking at our phone with somebody, we're using those as part of our communication. And we use objects. So maybe when you're talking to somebody, you might be pointing at something around you. And of course writing. So all those forms of alternative communication we use as part of our daily, everyday communication. And this is just going to look at how we can use some of those forms a bit more in detail with our children who need support. So who is AAC for? Well, there are various groups who can benefit from using AAC. One group are children and young people who cannot physically produce speech or who have difficulty moving their mouth muscles so that when they do produce speech, it's not intelligible. People can't understand what they're saying clearly. Another group are children and young people with learning difficulties, because this can have an impact on how they learn language. And it may mean that there's a gap between what they're able to say and what they're able to understand. And also it may mean that they are just a bit slow with developing their spoken language, so they need another way of communicating while speech develops. A third group are pupils with severe hearing impairment. Obviously this affects all areas of their language because they're not hearing language modelled to them around in their environment. These pupils use signing, but they can also use symbols as well. And another group, I've put those slightly separately, are children who we call selective talkers or children with selective mutism. And in some cases, having an alternative way or another way that they can communicate can be really helpful for them in the classroom, where actually it's just too hard for them to communicate with speech. So let's look at these areas in more detail and maybe think about the children and young people you're working with or your son or daughter as we go through these. So the first one, children who have learning difficulties. And as I said, this may impact on their rate of learning language. So some of these children and young people are able to use speech, but they may have delayed understanding because of their learning difficulties. And there may or may not be a gap between what they can understand and how they can express themselves. So for these children, symbols, objects and pictures will help to develop their understanding because they're visual, and we know that a lot of these children have strong visual skills, but they can also help to support their expression if they haven't yet developed speech, but they have some understanding. If the child or young person has a hearing impairment, then as we said, they're not going to be hearing the language around them, so it's more difficult for them to learn the language. It may also be that because they can't hear the language, it's difficult for them to use their speech as other people around them are using it, and therefore they may be difficult to understand. Their speech might not be clear. So these children and young people can use signing, so British Sign Language, Makaton, alongside their speech to help them develop their language skills. They can also use writing as well. Some children with hearing impairment may also benefit from using a high-tech communication aid, but this should be discussed with all those involved. A third group that I'm going to cover are children and young people who cannot physically produce speech, perhaps because of a neurological problem which affects their muscles, so they aren't able to control their muscle movement, or they find it difficult to control their muscle movement. So either they are not able to produce speech, or if they do speak, their speech might be slurred or difficult to understand. This group includes children with complex medical conditions such as cerebral palsy and other physical disabilities. Also, it includes children with unintelligible speech, which may be as a result of something called dyspraxia, or from dysarthria, which is where there is difficulty controlling the muscles, or it may be due to a severe speech disorder. With these children, they may actually have good understanding of language, or they may have learning difficulties. It varies depending on the child and on their medical condition. However, these children definitely benefit from using AAC. The last group I want to look at are children with autistic spectrum disorder diagnoses or social communication difficulties. Some children with autistic spectrum disorder may be non-verbal. That means they may not use speech. So in these cases, AAC can be helpful in giving the children or young person a means or a method to communicate. There are a variety of methods that can be used with these children, and that's something to discuss with your speech and language therapist. So we've talked about AAC, we've talked about the children who can benefit from it, but what are the difficulties if we're not using AAC? So if the introduction of AAC is delayed, then it means that the child or young person will not have a really effective means of communicating for themselves. So they have reduced ability to control their environment, to make their needs known, to tell people what they're thinking or feeling, to make requests, to comment on things, to ask questions. All those things are more difficult if we don't give them AAC to start with. This may also affect the development of their language skills, because if they're not practicing using language, then they can't develop those skills as easily. If they've got no means to practice with speech, then they're not going to have the ability to develop the skills of linking words, building sentences. It also means that they have less opportunity for social interaction, because social interaction is all about using words. We can also use our body, but as we want to develop our social interaction, we use words. So they have less opportunity to develop their social interaction skills. And obviously, using communication is important in life skills, because we use communication to get our needs known, to ask for help for things. And if you haven't got a means of communicating, then developing your life skills is going to be that much harder. So ultimately, that may lead to difficulties with employment and education. And these are all factors that have been identified by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. It's therefore really important that we make sure that AAC is available for children who need it, and that it's introduced early so that their language skills aren't delayed. So for a child using AAC, sometimes it feels like it's a different way of learning, if they're using symbols or photos or sign. But I want to show you that actually the needs of the child using AAC and the needs of the child learning to speak are very similar. So let's look first at the needs of a child who's learning to speak. So a typically developing young baby. So they need to hear speech around them. They hear people talking for about a year before they actually start to use words. And all that time, they're learning to make a link between what they hear and what they see is going on around them, what they see is happening to them. So they're beginning to understand speech, but they're hearing it, they're immersed in that speaking environment. Another need they have is that they need their environment to be positive about any attempts they make at speech. So if you think about responses to a young baby when they're learning to babble, parents will babble back to them, or when they're starting to say their words, parents are delighted. So they're getting a very positive approach to their early attempts at speech. A child learning to speak also needs to practice their speaking. Of course they do. And they get a lot of practice because little ones, when they're developing their speech, they're talking a lot, non-stop in fact. So first of all, they'll be trying out a few single words. Maybe they won't sound that clear to start with, but they'll practice them, they'll develop them. So they're getting lots of practice, and then practice linking words to make little sentences. And the last thing that I've got on my list is that the child learning speech needs to be able to understand speech. Of course they do. They're not going to be able to speak it unless they understand it. So now let's look at the child who uses AAC and see if there are any differences. So the child with AAC needs to see AAC being used. So that is exactly the same as the child who's learning to speak. The child who's learning to speak needs to hear speech. The child who's learning to use AAC needs to hear you speaking to them, but also see you using their AAC system with them. So if it's sign, you sign to them. If it's symbols or photos, you use those with them. This is what we call modelling, and it's really, really important. Remember I said that a child hears language for about a year before they start speaking. Well, I'm not saying that has to happen for AAC, but the more you can input to the child, the better it is. The AAC child also needs an environment that is positive about their attempts to use AAC and rewards their use. They're not going to get it right all the time, just like the speaking child is not going to. But if we're positive and we listen and we make time for that and we respond to their attempts at communication, that's going to encourage more attempts. So the child also needs to practice with their AAC. We said that a child who's learning to speak practices speaking all the time. Sometimes you can't shut children up. And this is exactly the same for a child with AAC. So a signing child or a child with a communication book or child learning to use single symbols and photos. They need to practice that. And that sometimes feels a bit harder because we're actually having to use an additional system. We're not just using speech, which is obviously readily available to us. But it's so important to give that child the ability to practice using the AAC, practicing as part of everyday activities, and maybe as well setting aside time to practice specific things. The child with AAC also needs to understand speech and AAC. So that's where one of the differences between these two children come in. So our child who's learning to speak just needs to understand speech. But our child who's learning AAC, in fact, they're sort of bilingual, aren't they? Because they need to understand speech and they need to understand their symbols or their sign. So just bear that in mind because we're actually asking quite a lot of these children. And the other thing that is a difference, and it's quite a key difference, is that the child who's learning AAC needs a supportive communication partner, because very often the adult is the person who will bring their book to them if they're in a wheelchair, or who will bring their photos to them, or who will set up their communication aid for them, or who needs to learn sign to be able to sign with them. So the supportive communication partner is key in this situation, because otherwise the child with AAC is in a speaking world and they're not seeing their device or their AAC system used, and they maybe don't have as much access to it as they need. So in summary, the main differences are that the child learning AAC is a multilingual child. They've got to understand speech, but then they've got to be able to respond using their mode of AAC, so signing or photos. The environment or the communication partner is really, really vital for the child with a physical disability, because the child is going to need support to use their device. They're going to need their vocabulary updated on their device. It's no good just staying static. They can't do those things. They need us to help and to anticipate those needs. And the other key difference is the child will need more time, because especially using symbols can be slower, and using sign is slower than using speech, so they need more time to communicate. We need to make sure that other children aren't jumping in and talking for them or over them. They need that time to communicate, and they need a partner who knows how to use their communication systems. So if you feel that you don't know how to use your child's communication system with them, please don't be afraid to ask. That's what speech and language therapists are there for, and we'd really be happy to chat that over with you. So I talked about modelling and why that's important, and I said modelling is us using the child's AAC system, whether it's sign or photos or symbols, to them so that they can learn it incidentally, just as part of everyday language. And I want to try and show you why modelling is so important. So have a look at this picture here. These are some symbols, and I've made up a communication board, and this would be the sort of thing that we might use, not exactly like this, but we might use with children. So have a look at those symbols and see if you understand some of them. Now normally we put words with our symbols, and so it's okay for adults who are literate to be able to read the words and understand the symbols, but we forget what it's like for the child. Hopefully, looking at those symbols, you can actually see that there's a picture of a beach. So you might be able to work out that that means beach. I'm not sure how many of the other symbols you can understand, but you might have got a bit of an idea. I can't demonstrate this to you using the PowerPoint, but if I was with you, I would then start pointing to the symbols and talking about them as I pointed to them. So I might point to the yellow symbol and say, you, where are you going? Pointing to the green symbol with the finger pointing. Where are you going? So that way you've now learned that you is that symbol there with somebody pointing to another little stick finger, and going is that symbol with the pointy finger. I might say, did you go? So point to the yellow symbol, then the green symbol again. Did you go to the cinema? That's the picture with the it's sort of a house with like a screen and a row of people in it. Did you go to the cinema? And point to the cinema. Point to you and go. Did you go to the museum? That's the next orange one down. Or I might point and say, did you go to the beach? And through me pointing to those symbols as I'm talking and asking you questions, you'll be learning what those symbols mean, just incidentally. Now, obviously, you don't have learning difficulties, so you can probably remember what those symbols are now, and if I showed you them again, you'd know what they are. But for a child who does have some learning difficulties, actually using these symbols again and again and again is how they're going to learn what they mean. Let's go on to the next slide, and then you can see what all the symbols did mean. I didn't tell you about the yesterday symbol, but you've got it there. So you can see that if you point to the symbols as you say them, then the child can learn what they mean. Let's look at a video about modelling in the context of using a communication aid or symbol, so that it would be the same for both. And if you're thinking about sign, if your child is a signer, then what they're doing with their symbols, you would do with your signing. So have a look at this video. I thought it would be useful next to look at what we call the ladder of symbolic understanding, because your child might have been given photographs, they might have been given symbols, they might be using words to support their communication, or they might be using objects. And I just wanted to go through why they might be at the different levels. So when we look at symbolic understanding, language, spoken language, is very symbolic. A word, why should the word cat mean cat? It does, but why should it? So it's very abstract. You hear it and it's gone. With pictures and objects, they stay around for a bit longer, so that's why we say that they're much easier for children with learning difficulties or disabilities to understand. And let's look at the first thing that we would introduce. So for children who are really emergent communicators, very young children or children who've got lots of difficulties with their learning, real objects are the easiest way for them to learn. So we may recommend you use real objects. The next level up is a toy which represents the object. So it's not the real object, but there is an increasing level of symbolism. Then we've got colour photos of the real object. Again, just getting that little bit more symbolic, a little bit more abstract. Moving on to colour symbols of the object. You can see as we're going up that ladder, they're getting a little bit more difficult to interpret. Then a black and white line drawing, which is really quite difficult to interpret. And then obviously you've got your written word or your spoken word. So it depends where your child is in their journey of learning language, where they might start. We might continue to use photographs all the way through. So they might be at the word level, but still be using some photographs because photographs are nice. You might want a photograph of your family because that's a nice thing to share, even though you're using words or using symbols. So you might not be hard and fast in that you're always just using symbols or always just using photographs, but that gives you an idea of the progression. This slide looks at the difference between AAC and visual support, and it's probably quite a useful slide for more for preschools and schools. So AAC is a communication system. It's actually for communication. So an AAC system, whether it's sign or symbols or photos, it supports the child to express themselves. So it supports them to comment, to ask questions, to name things, to request things. It does also help with their understanding, but that's sort of a positive byproduct. It's not the main aim. The main aim is to help them, give them a way to express themselves, but it's great that actually having the symbols and photos also helps to build understanding. So with an AAC system, we're looking to bridge a gap between what the child can understand and what they can communicate or can express. So usually their understanding is ahead of their ability to communicate, and so that can be frustrating. So we want to use the system, the communication system, to help bridge that gap so we can develop their expressive language skills. And hopefully the AAC system can help reduce frustration if it's used appropriately and used well, because it's giving the child a voice. Might not be a spoken voice, but it's a voice that they can use to show us who they are, what their personality is, what their likes are, what their dislikes are, and just help them be part of a communication world, which is what we live in. Visual support's a bit different from that. Visual support is something that we use to help support a child's understanding of language. So with our child with learning difficulties who is speaking, they may use visual support because a picture is going to be easier to understand than just the word on its own. So if they're using if they're learning the concept of big, they might have a symbol to support that or objects to support that, because that's going to help them understand the concept of big, which is quite abstract. Visual support also helps a child understand what will happen next. So you can use a variety of visual support strategies like now and next boards, visual timetables. And it also helps to reduce anxiety because if you've got things like now and next boards, or if you've got pictures that help a child to understand what's happening, or a social story to help a child that's understand what's happening, it will help to reduce anxiety. This is just a quick slide to give some examples of visual support. So we've got a visual timetable. You can see that there, the one on the right with the red background. You can use objects of reference. So we've got some keys there that might be an object of reference. So when you're going out, you show the child the keys and they link that to going out. It helps them to understand about what's happening, maybe anticipate a bit. Signing can be used as a visual support. Vocabulary boards. So it may be that you're learning a topic at school and you need some words to support the child's understanding of that vocabulary. And tick boxes can be used as visual support to help a child progress through an activity. There are loads of ways of visual support. These are just a few, and it's just to show how that it's a bit different from AAC itself. So let's look at types of AAC. Well, we've got some low-tech types where we can use pictures, we can use topic boards, we can use communication books, we can exchange pictures. So there are low-tech types. There's a few examples there. You can see a well-used communication book, you can see a topic board there. We've got some light-tech examples like Big Macs or other switch message devices. So that's where you press that red button and the Big Mac says hello, or you might press it and it says turn the page if you're doing a reading activity, or you might press it and it says my name is, or you might press it and it says more if you're playing bubbles or something. And then you've got high technology types of AAC, so that they are iPad or tablet based communication aids, which can be used either by direct access, so like we use our phones and our iPads with a finger, or they can be used with switches, or they can be used with something called eye gaze, where the computer actually reads where your eyes are looking, or they can be used with things like a head mouse, where your head controls the mouse like we would use with our hands, but you have the computer is able to detect head movements to control the mouse. Communication aids are usually introduced after a child has got a low-tech or paper-based system, and if it's something that you're interested in pursuing, then please do talk to your speech and language therapist about this. If your child meets certain criteria, there are centres that we can refer your child to get a communication aid for them, but they do, as I say, have criteria. This slide looks at why and how a child might communicate. So we're looking at means, reasons and opportunities. The means is how we communicate. So obviously for a speaking child that's speech, but for the children we're talking about today it might be sign or symbols or photographs or a communication aid. The reasons are why we communicate, and the opportunities are when, where and with whom. And to be a good communicator we need to use a balance of all these, because without the means to communicate, the child can't express themselves. So they need their communication system with them at all times. Without a reason to communicate, why would they communicate? There's no reason, there's no point, there's no need. And without opportunities, then there'll be not enough time to practice, and if you can't practice, you can't get good at using your system, and then when you need to use your system to communicate, you don't know where anything is, you don't know how to do it, and then communication breaks down. So if we look at the words in those three rings, the means we've talked about, that's the body language, the sign, the symbols, and actually we want our children with AAC to be what we call total communicators. So they might be using their communication book, but they might also be eye pointing across the room, looking at something they're interested in. They might be using their body or their facial expression to give you some clue as well. So we want total communication. We're all total communicators. We use gesture. Just because we're speaking, it doesn't mean we don't use gesture or pointing or facial expression. The reasons, well, maybe they want to get attention. Maybe they want to express what they want or what they need. Maybe they want to answer a question in class, give some information. Maybe they want to protest about something, to say, no, I don't want that. Maybe they want to tell you what their feelings are. Maybe they want to make a choice. All those reasons, we need to think about what reasons does our child have to communicate. If we're meeting all their needs for them, if we're anticipating their needs or assuming what their needs are, then we're not providing them a reason to communicate. We're taking away those reasons for communication. And opportunities. So we've got to think about who are the child's communication partners at school, at home. Do they know how to use their systems? Does grandma know how to use the communication aid? Is there a really good time for communication? Maybe dinner is a good time. Maybe you all sit around and they can use their communication systems at dinner. Or maybe dinner is a really bad time because actually it's too stressful. So thinking about the really good times when you can communicate, and maybe trying to set aside a time, because as we said, if some of our children are using communication books, that can be a little harder and take a little longer. So maybe setting aside a time so they have that opportunity at school and at home. Where are they communicating? Let's look and make sure that communication is supported at home and at school. And have we got things that they want to communicate about? So that links with reasons, but also opportunities. Can they talk about things that they like talking about in the right context? So when they're with their friends, have they got the right vocabulary? Have a look at a video now of a child using AAC, and you'll hopefully see the adult using some modelling, using some response, and some of the things that we've talked about already. It's always nice to see AAC happening in practice. Okay, now we're going to look at different types of AAC in a bit more detail. So you can see there's a board here. What would you use this board for? Now this board has got quite a few cells on it. It's got 12, I think. No, 15. No, 20. Sorry, 20. And so not all children with AAC would be able to use this. This might be too complex for some children. We have to match the type of communication we use with the needs and the skills of the child. So this might be for a child who's sort of understanding about a 2-3 year level, maybe more a 3-year level. But you can see that this is what we call an activity board or a topic board. It's about an activity. In this case, it's about Mr. Potato Head. So it's a self-contained board which relates to one activity. So it could relate to other activities like cooking, or a game that you like playing, or maybe relating to an activity you're doing in class, and it's self-contained. So if you look at this, you can see that the vocabulary is arranged from left to right to build a sentence, because this child that it's designed for is able to, or is starting to be able to build very simple sentences or starting to link words. So you can do I want feet, and then so the child says I want feet, and then you give them the feet for their Mr. Potato Head. It may be actually that the child is just at the level of saying want feet, and if that's the case, then you could model the next stage up. I want feet. Because we always think about the next stage with our communication support. We don't want to just give them words at the level they're at, because we need to have a bit of room for them to grow into. It's a bit like buying a pair of shoes. You buy that tiny bit of a gap so that the children can grow into them. We want them to be able to grow into their AAC systems, and we want to be able to model the next stage up. So if they're saying want hat, cap, then we're saying you want cap or I want cap. You are modelling the next stage up. So these type of boards are aimed to develop expressive language skills. They can be used to develop understanding of vocabulary, because you're pointing to the words as you're saying them. So it may be that there's words here that they didn't understand, but as you use them a lot, they're going to understand them. So that's activity boards. Some ideas of using them. Well, we've just shown you Mr. Potato Head, but it could be dressing up. It could be any activity that you do at school or home. But the idea is that we're going to model language to the child by pointing to the symbols as we speak. We're going to think about the language level that the child is at and make sure the board is appropriate for that. And we're going to model, as I said, the next stage up. We're going to think about the language that we want them to use. It's not just using objects. We're not just using the vocabulary for teeth and moustache, but we're using some action words, some doing words, the want and the like and the help and the fix and the finished. We're using some pronouns. We're using some negatives. I don't want the feet. And as I said, we're extending or modelling what the children's language. What would you use this board for? So this board is what we might call a storyboard. And again, you can see from left to right, we've got the sentence building ability. So again, this is for a child who's able to link words. But you've got your sentence building from left to right. So Chip is on the swing. Will be an example there. And this might be a really nice way of a child learning to tell you a story or retell a story. So again, it's about communication. It's not about literacy. It's not about reading. It's not about writing, but it's learning to tell a story. If you're thinking about the literacy side of things, then obviously link in with your teacher and discuss literacy with them. And if you know your child knows some of these words, then obviously you don't need to put the symbol. You can just have the word there, because we want to develop their literacy skills as much as possible. So if they can read the word on and to, then actually use just those words, especially as things like to are quite abstract. So actually having the word there on its own is probably as good as having it with a symbol. So the idea about storyboards, they can help to sequence ideas. Again, they're developing expressive language, so that's the linking of words into a sentence. And maybe for some children, it would be a lot simpler than this. So this, I said, was a child who's able to link words, but it may be that you just want, when you're reading a familiar story, you just want some words. So you might say, Biff went to the, and you could have just those symbols, the orange symbols, and your child could learn to say park, or point to park to say park. When I say I mean they're speaking it through the symbols. So you might just have those few symbols at the end there because you want it at a simpler level. But that would be something you would discuss with your speech and language therapist, because obviously everything needs to be adapted to each child's level. So some general points to bring out from looking at those different types of boards. Visual support helps learning. It's multimodality learning, that's got to be good. So they're hearing the word, they're seeing the word. By using these forms of communication, we're valuing the alternative and augmentative communication method the child's using, because we're using it with them. May help to recap on the lesson, to give them a bit of a memory jog. We've said that having the picture can help support comprehension. These can be used in mainstream as well as in special schools. They can be very supportive in different environments. You don't just have to use the symbols, you can use photos and pictures as well. And obviously we said that you should remove the symbols as literacy develops, and obviously link in with your literacy teachers with this, because what I'm talking about here is communication. It's the talking side of things, not the writing or the reading side of things. This slide is a very, very brief summary about PECS. PECS stands for Picture Exchange Communication Systems, and in Bromley we use what we call token exchange, and that is pretty much the same as picture exchange communication. So picture exchange communication, or token exchange as we call it, is about giving a photo or a picture or even an object to exchange for something a child wants. It's about developing intent to communicate with children who have no functional communication. So some children may use behaviour rather than symbolic communication to get what they want. So they may take your hand and lead you, or to where their packet of crisps is if they want the crisps, or they may take your hand and put it on a toy if they want more of it. So they are communicating through their behaviour and their body, but what we want to try and develop is communication through a symbolic system. So we start by using photos, and we get them to exchange these photos. So rather than dragging you to the cupboard to get the crisps, they actually give you a photo of the crisps. And this is a very specialised approach, and it's a separate training course, so I just wanted to mention it here. Sometimes there's a confusion between token exchange and using AAC. With AAC we're pointing to symbols, and with token exchange we're giving symbols. It is a different system. Communication books. These are books which contain pages divided into categories for the child or young person to point to or look at if they're using their eyes. Each book is divided into a core page and a topic page. The core page you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. So that's got familiar everyday words like I and like and help and stop. And those are words that make up 80% of what we say. And then the topic page is related to a specific category. So in this case, we've got places, so home and swimming pool, but it could be a topic page. There could be a page that was food, transport, feelings, toys. So a communication book has the core page on the left, the topic page on the right, and this goes throughout the book. So as you turn the pages, you get the core page on the left and then the next topic, then the core page on the left and the next topic. And communication books usually have an index to help the adult find their way around the book. This communication book should be individualised, and it should develop as the child's understanding and vocabulary develops. So as you can see, there are some blanks and these can be filled in. So if your child has a communication book, don't worry about redoing the page. If there's a blank, write the word and draw a picture so the child can communicate about it there and then. So the child's language and vocabulary should be developing as the child's skills develop. Communication books can have photos and or symbols, and the size of the grid will depend on the language skills of the child and also on their visual skills and maybe on their physical skills, because if they're pointing and they haven't got very good pointing, they may need larger cells. So it's a balance of all those areas, the language learning level, their visual skills, so how easy it is for them to see the pictures, and their physical skills. Communication books are a great way for children to talk about everyday things. So they have a large number of topics with a lot of vocabulary, but you can't go into so much depth with them. And as with all forms of AAC, they should be modelled. So you, as you're talking to the child, you will be turning to the different pages and pointing to things. And as you're doing that, it's really important to say, for example, right, let's go to the places page, and then say something on the places page. Objects of reference. Objects of reference are used with children who are emerging communicators or who aren't yet able to anticipate things, understand words. So children with profound and multiple learning disabilities. They're also used for with children with visual impairments, because obviously it's much harder to use photos, or it may be impossible to use photos or symbols, so objects are better in that case. Objects of reference are best if they are related to the activity that they represent. So for example, here we've got the keys, as we said before, because when you're going out, you grab your keys, put them in your pocket and off you go. So that's a good link. So it may be that the child is hearing those keys as you get ready to go out, and it might be something that you can link for them. Another example might be bath time, having a duck or a sponge or a flannel. We have got some standard objects of reference that we are trying to introduce across Bromley Healthcare so that everybody uses the same objects of reference, because obviously with these children it's important that we don't change things when they go from preschool to school and do different things between the home and the educational setting. Objects of reference are used, as I said, to help make a link between an activity that's about to happen and try and introduce anticipation with the child. For children with a visual impairment, they might also be used as a way of expressing. So a child might choose between two objects of reference to say, this is what I want to play with, Mum. Colour coding. Something I haven't mentioned as we've gone through looking at the symbol boards and charts is colour coding. In AAC, we tend to use the Fitzgerald key, and you can see the colour coding for the Fitzgerald key here. That's something that you can talk about with your speech and language therapist a bit more, whether you're a parent or whether you're somebody working in education. So you can see here that, for example, people are always yellow, and I don't know if you remember, but the boards were yellow for the people. We were doing left to right sentences, then green for the action words, and then orange for the nouns. That's the Fitzgerald key, and that tends to be the colour coding system on a number of communication aids. There is another colour coding system called colourful semantics, which is used more with children with language disorder, so for example in the language unit, and so AAC can be adapted to the colourful semantics colour coding. Choosing vocabulary is a really important part about all forms of AAC. We've sort of touched on it a bit as we've gone through, but it is very important, so I'm just going to go over a bit of a summary here. So when you're choosing vocabulary for a child, some of the communication books are standard, and then we need to personalise them. When you're personalising them, or when you're making up a board from scratch, think about, what does the child need or want to talk about? What's going to motivate them? So their favourite toys have got to be in there. What are their peers talking about? If they're a bit older, we want their language to be cool. If they're maybe secondary age or a high junior age, what are their peers talking about? How many words can they cope with? So that we talked about in terms of their vision skills, their physical skills, and their language learning skills. And what is necessary? For example, if there is already something they can communicate differently, so maybe they can say yes by nodding or smiling, then you wouldn't put yes in a communication board or chart. If they can communicate something in an activity that you're doing in class by looking, then you wouldn't necessarily put that word on a topic board. And because space is often, there isn't much space and you want to put words down, if there is a way a child can communicate something, then decide whether you actually do need to put that symbol down. Always as well remember core and fringe vocabulary. So core is frequently used words and fringe words are the less frequently used topic words. So think about those, and about the child being able to use a variety of types of communication. So ask a question or say no negatives, so I don't want that, make a comment, all those sort of things, not just requesting things. Obviously all that I've just said goes hand in hand with their language ability, so for some children it might not be appropriate to work on negatives, but for others it would be. Switch message devices are brilliant. They are an absolutely vital part of communication for a child using AAC, and they can be used for a whole range of things. So basically, you record a message on it and then the child plays that by hitting the switch. They can be adapted for children's physical needs, so you can actually plug in a head switch to something like this Big Mac so they can use it with their head. They're really great to help children engage in activities, for example, answering the register, sharing news, joining in with stories, choice making, having a joke. They're great because they're small and they're portable. A way I really like to do it is to use a switch for news between home and school. So if the school record just a couple of sentences, so I painted a picture today and I went in the playground, and then when the child gets home they can tell this to their parent, and equally their parent can record a message and send that back into school. So they're great for that sort of thing. There's only a limited number of messages that can be stored depending on the device. Some can only store one, some can store a couple, and there are loads and loads of ideas for how to use switches like this on the internet, and there's an example of a link there. High-tech aids. There's only one slide on this, so it's a very brief summary, and as I said before, if you're interested in high-tech aids, communication aids for your child, then please do speak to your speech and language therapist. But basically there are a wide variety of high-tech aids, all different sorts, and constantly there are new ones coming on the market as well. Some of the software can be on mainstream hardware, so you can put some vocabulary software onto phones or laptops or iPads, and some are dedicated communication aids, so purely used for communication. As with all AAC, you need to choose the right communication aid for your child according to their language, their ability, their physical skills. And as I said before, if you want a communication aid and you want to go to a funding centre for assessment and provision of a communication aid, your child needs to have reached certain levels of language understanding. So that would be something to talk to your speech and language therapist about. There are various AAC, what we call AAC hubs. Our local ones are Great Ormond Street and Evelina, and children can be referred to those for a trial of a device, but they have to meet criteria first. Communication aids are great and they really work for some children, but for other children, having a paper-based, a low-tech system is just as good, if not better, because although high-tech aids have a voice which speaks out, they're also less forgiving than a person holding a communication book, because if you hit a cell accidentally and you end up changing page and going to a different topic, it can be very confusing for a young learner. So there are pluses and minuses to all forms of communication systems, and it's about getting the best fit for your child. This last slide is just to leave you with a few resources that you may want to follow up on. Communication Matters is a website dedicated to AAC and is a really good resource. And then I've mentioned Great Ormond Street and Guy's and St Thomas's Assistive Communication Services. Inclusive Technology has a lot of switches. It's so that's a good place to go and look at what's available. Yes, have a look at the resources, and if you want to follow up anything, please do get in contact with the Speech and Language Therapy Department or with your local speech and language therapist. Thank you very much for attending this training. I hope it's been useful. It's been really good to share this introduction to AAC with you, and there is a feedback form as well, which we'd be really grateful for you to fill in. Thank you. Bye-bye.